Dry Creek wasn't a kind town. Folks kept their boots loud and their laughter louder, so the silence wouldn't remind them who they really were. The cracked bell above the courthouse rang crooked at sundown, calling people into the alley like it was fair day. But it wasn't fair day. It was a show, a bet, dressed up as a marriage. The bride stood in brown calico, hem ragged, hands steady. Ada Pike, widow in name, burden in truth. She wore a thin ribbon around her throat, a bent brass band, strung like a pendant, all she had left from the man who'd gone to the mines and never come home. The town kept a ledger on women like Ada. Whispers, debts, shame, tallied neat. The groom showed late, which was part of the joke. Jonah Reed. Ex-scout, scarred shoulder. Too many nights sleeping under cottonwoods with no one to call his name. Men shoved him toward the bell, grinning wide. They had written the bet on a scrap of paper. Bring proof of a wedding by sundown. In return, one bay mare, with a star on her brow, and rope worth a cowboy's pride. Jonah kept that folded slip in his breast pocket, close enough to burn. No preacher, no judge. Instead, Mrs. Cross from the feed store Bible memorized like an account book. She stood on a crate and said, "Do you both consent?" "Yes," Jonah muttered, the word flat as chalk. "Yes," Ada said, after a pause that made the crowd fidget. Her voice was like creek water, finding a path through stone. They joined hands. His hot, hers cool. The place where they met was neither. When asked for tokens, Jonah tore a loop of braided horsehair from his hatband. Ada slipped the brass band from her ribbon, but instead of giving it to Mrs. Cross, she pressed it onto Jonah's finger. The crowd rustled like corn before a storm. "For you," she whispered. "Only for him. So you have something to carry besides paper." The words struck him deeper than the jeers. The bent brass clinked against his knuckle, ill-fitting but insistent. Proof. Yes, but not the kind the men in the saloon had asked for. They kissed because Mrs. Cross said they must. Not sweet, not cruel. A debt settled in skin. And then Ada did what nobody expected. She reached into Jonah's shirt, plucked the folded bet paper from his pocket, and tucked it into her own dress. Quiet, deft, like she'd taken a snake by the neck. "We'll burn this when the cold comes," she breathed. "Worth more as fire than as proof." The crowd laughed, hooted, clapped. To them it was still a jest. But Jonah felt the ground shift. The ring pressed into his hand like a nail, and the paper gone from his pocket left him lighter and ashamed all at once. When they left the alley, Dry Creek didn't cheer. It scattered, satisfied it had bought its show. The town would forget by morning, but Jonah would not. Beside him, Ada walked steady, skirts dragging dust, head high in a way that wasn't pride but something sterner. They didn't speak, yet the air between them was thick as smoke. The bet had been won, but Jonah knew he wasn't the one holding the proof anymore, and maybe that was the real shock, that he didn't mind. The town lights dwindled behind them until they were only fireflies pinned against the hills. Jonah led Brandy by the reins, the horse plodding with steady patience. Ada walked beside him, her hem dragging a faint trail in the dust. They looked like two shadows stitched together by silence. "Best you ride," Jonah said after the first mile. His voice was rough, not from drink, but from a man unused to using it kindly. "It's a long road yet." Ada shook her head. "I'll walk while the houses can see. Don't want them thinking you carried me out like a prize hog." Her tone wasn't sharp, just plain, like she was explaining how the weather worked. Jonah had no answer. He swallowed it down, letting the crickets fill the space. The bent brass ring on his finger clicked every time his knuckle brushed the rain. He tried not to feel it, but he couldn't forget it was there. The paper was gone, tucked into Ada's dress. That absence pressed harder than the ring itself. When the last fence post of Dry Creek faded into the dark, Ada finally touched the saddle. "All right, she'll take both of us?" Jonah nodded. "Brandy'll take two and not complain." He swung up first, then offered a hand. Ada placed her palm in his, cool and firm, and let him pull her onto the mare's back. She didn't clutch his waist like a nervous girl. She sat steady, one hand on the saddle horn, the other resting lightly against his coat. That small touch made Jonah's chest heat more than the fire ever had. They rode in quiet. The moon laid a silver path across the scrub, and the cottonwoods ahead swayed like dark sentries. Jonah listened to the rhythm of hooves, the creak of leather, and the faint, steady breath at his back. The bet that had started as a cruel joke was already shifting, becoming something heavier, something he hadn't asked for and didn't know if he could carry. "Why'd you say yes?" he asked at last, low enough the night might swallow it if she chose not to answer. Ada leaned forward a little, not to whisper, but to think. "Because saying no would have cost me more. The town would have made sure of it. Sometimes you marry a man to keep from being married to shame." Jonah winced. He knew truth when he heard it, and this one cut clean. He wanted to tell her she wasn't wrong, but words weren't a hammer he knew how to swing right. Instead, he touched his hand to the reins, tightened them slightly, and let the mare choose the smoother trail. It was all the answer he could give. They crossed the creek at the ford. Water lapped at Brandy's knees, cold enough to bite. Ada's dress caught the spray, darkening in patches. She didn't complain. She tilted her head back, watching the stars. "Feels cleaner out here," she murmured. "Like the sky don't care what folks think." Jonah almost smiled. Sky never did. The ride stretched long, the land rolled gentle, rising into the foothills where his cabin waited. Coyotes yipped far off, and once Brandy tossed her head at a rustle in the brush. Jonah's hand brushed Ada's knee when he steadied the reins. He meant nothing by it, but the touch stayed with him, sharp as flint. At last, the outline of his place came into view. A cabin squatting under the cottonwoods, smoke from the chimney long gone cold. The fence leaned like a tired drunk, and the shed beside it bore the scars of too many winters. But the cabin stood, and it was his. Ada exhaled softly, not quite a sigh. "You keep it neat," she said, as he swung down. Jonah helped her dismount. "Neat's all a man can manage, mostly." He looked at her, the firelight memory from town still caught in her hair. "But it holds." Inside, the air smelled of pine shavings and dust, with a faint trace of coffee ground too fine. Jonah lit a lamp. Ada stood in the doorway for a moment, her eyes roaming the single room, the narrow bed, the iron stove, the stacked wood, the shelves with a few chipped plates. She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders eased. "You can make a life here," she said simply. Then she set the folded bet paper on the table, her fingers resting on it like a warning. But not with this hanging over it. Jonah stared at the paper, black ink curling like a noose. He realized the mare, the rope, the prize, all of it felt smaller than this woman standing in his cabin, bent brass shining against his hand. Ada met his eyes. "Tomorrow, we'll burn it. Tonight, we rest." Morning came thin and pale, the kind of light that makes a cabin look smaller than an island. Frost lay white over the split rails, and the creek muttered under a skin of ice. Jonah rose first, as he always did, but when he pulled on his boots, Ada was already up, coaxing the stove with patient hands. Her hair was loose, dark against the smoke. "You keep your wood dry," she said without turning. "That's worth something." Jonah stood in the doorway, unsure whether to thank her. Compliments had always been a language he didn't speak. Instead, he poured water from the jug into the kettle and set it beside her on the iron. It hissed and steamed. Their silence was companionable this time, not sharp. When the fire caught, Ada reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded bet paper. She smoothed it on the table with the flat of her hand, then looked at Jonah. "It's time." Jonah hesitated. He could almost feel the horse under him, the bay mare with her star, the rawhide rope, the way the boys at the saloon would have nodded, saying, "Reed still knows how to win." But the paper on the table wasn't a prize anymore. It was a chain. Ada held out the tongs. "You light it." Jonah took the slip, pinched it between the iron ends, and fed it into the stove. The fire licked at it greedily, curling the ink into black snakes. It popped once, then folded in on itself. Ada closed the stove door, and the ash became part of their warmth. "Now it's ours," she said softly. Jonah sat back on the bench, staring at the bent brass ring on his hand. He wondered when it had stopped feeling like a joke and started feeling like a brand. They worked side by side that day, not speaking much. Jonah chopped wood, the rhythm steady, his breath hanging in clouds. Ada took a bucket down to the creek, broke the skim of ice with a stone, and hauled water up the bank. She washed his dishes with brisk care, drying each plate on her skirt before setting it back in its place. By noon, the cabin looked less like a bachelor's den and more like a home. Jonah noticed. He didn't say it out loud, but he noticed. In the afternoon, Ada patched the tear in her hem, needle flashing in the low light. Jonah sharpened, his axe on the grindstone. From time to time, his eyes strayed to her hands, steady and competent, the faint burn scar on her wrist glimmering under the lamplight. "Where'd you get that mark?" he asked finally. Ada glanced down, then back up. "Stove in the boarding house last winter. Too many kettles, not enough hands." She tied off the thread with her teeth. "Didn't have salve, so it healed ugly. Folks said it made me look careless." Jonah grunted. "Folks say too much." For the first time, a small smile ghosted across her mouth. It wasn't wide, but it reached her eyes. That night, Jonah spread the blankets so they'd cover both sides of the bed. Ada hesitated at the threshold. "You sure?" He nodded. "I said I wouldn't touch you unless you asked. That still holds." She studied him for a long breath. Then she slipped under the covers, turning her back toward him but close enough that her warmth seeped through the cloth. Jonah lay stiff, staring at the rafters. His scar itched where the arrow had once torn him open. Minutes passed. Then, very quietly, Ada whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For meaning what you say." Jonah didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice. But in the silence, his hand shifted, not touching her, just resting on the mattress near hers. Close enough that if she wanted, she could bridge the distance. She didn't. Not yet. But her breathing slowed, and he knew she had fallen asleep without fear. For Jonah Reed, that was proof enough. Winter in Dry Creek country wasn't merciful. The wind came down from the mountains like it was sharpening its teeth, and every plank in Jonah's cabin groaned under the cold. Snow gathered in drifts along the fence line, and the creek ran black, too fast to freeze. Nights stretched long as sermons, and mornings came reluctant. Jonah and Ada worked together as if they had been at it for years. He chopped wood until his prowess shoulders burned. She stacked it in neat rows under the eaves. She cooked beans, cornbread, and whatever rabbit or quail he managed to bring back. Sometimes they spoke. More often, they didn't need to. The silence between them had changed shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was a quilt patched by small acts. But the town hadn't forgotten. One bitter morning, Havelock from the Mercantile rode up, his face red from the cold, his mustache stiff with frost. He brought 3 men with him, all grinning the way men do when they expect to see blood on the snow. "Reed," Havelock called, reining in his horse at the gate. "You've had your fun. Where's our proof?" Jonah stepped outside, coat unbuttoned, axe still in his hand. Ada was at the stove, but she came to the doorway, her shawl tight around her shoulders. Havelock sneered. "The paper, Reed. Don't tell me she burned it." A mare and a rope don't come cheap. His men chuckled. Jonah's jaw tightened. The paper was ash in the stove now, woven into the warmth that kept Ada's hands from freezing. Proof was gone. But what stood behind him, a firelit cabin, a woman steady in the doorway, was more real than any ink. "You'll get nothing," Jonah said evenly. "Wager's done." Havelock's grin cracked. "You calling us liars?" Ada stepped forward then, and her voice cut sharper than the wind. "No. He's calling you fools for thinking a piece of paper matters more than a ring and a fire. You wanted a show, you got it. But a marriage ain't yours to measure." The men shifted uneasily. It wasn't just her words, but the way she stood, straight, unflinching, the brass ring glinting on Jonah's finger behind her. Havelock spat into the snow. "You'll regret this, Reed. A man who doesn't pay his debts don't last long around here." He yanked his reins, turned his horse, and thundered off, the others following. When the sound of hooves faded, Ada turned back inside, cheeks flushed. Jonah watched her move across the room, the scar on her wrist catching the firelight. He set the axe down gently. "You didn't have to speak," he said. She ladled stew into bowls. "Didn't have to, but I wanted to." It was the first time she'd admitted wanting anything out loud. That night, the wind battered the shutters. Jonah lay awake, staring at the rafters. Ada shifted beside him, restless. Finally, she whispered, "I was wrong about shame." Jonah turned his head. "How so?" Her eyes were open in the dark, catching the faint glow of embers. "I thought marrying you would hide it, but it hasn't. It's burned it off. Shame doesn't live here anymore. Not since the paper turned to ash." Jonah reached for her hand. He didn't grab, just let his fingers brush hers on the quilt. She didn't pull away. Slowly, carefully, their hands laced together, the brass ring cool against her skin. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, two hands held fast. By early spring, word spread that Ada Pike had tamed Jonah Reed. Folks said it with a sneer, like a man's steadiness was shameful if a woman's hand steadied it. Dry Creek had long memories for grudges, and short ones for kindness, and tongues wagged faster than creek water in thaw. It started with whispers in the mercantile. She made him burn the proof. Then in the saloon, he keeps her hidden out at the cabin. By the time Sunday came, the church benches creaked under the weight of talk. Reed's a fool, and she's a witch in a plain dress. So when Jonah and Ada rode into town together one bright morning, Brandy's mane brushed, Ada's patched dress clean and mended. The crowd gathered without needing to be called. They watched like hawks circling over something wounded. Ada felt their stares like burrs on her skin. Jonah saw her chin lift, steady but not proud. He kept his hand near hers on the saddle horn, not touching, just close enough. They went about their errands: flour, lamp oil, nails. Havelock appeared in the street like he'd been waiting all week. His voice carried over the crowd. "Reed!" He spat the name like a challenge. "Tell these folks what happened to the paper, or admit you're a liar who stole his mare's worth." The air grew tight. A circle formed. Faces leaned forward, hungry, half smiling, ready to see shame nailed up. Jonah's jaw flexed. He could feel the scar on his shoulder ache, the brass ring cold against his finger. He opened his mouth, but before he spoke, Ada swung down from Brandy's back. Her boots struck the dirt sharp. She faced the crowd, shawl slipping loose, the burn scar on her wrist pale against the Sunday. She raised her voice so every ear caught it. "The paper's gone," she said. "Burned to ash. Because no man's bet decides if I am wife or widow. You think shame belongs to me? Shame belongs to anyone who thought I could be bought like feed." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some eyes dropped, others narrowed. Havelock barked a laugh. Big words for a woman who begged a man to take her name. Ada didn't flinch. She turned, slow and deliberate, until her eyes found Jonah. Then she reached for his hand. He gave it without hesitation this time. Their fingers laced tight, brass ring, catching the sunlight like a spark. The sight hushed the street. The cruel laughter faltered. For in that simple act, something shifted. It wasn't defiance shouted. It was defiance lived. Then from somewhere in the back, a child's voice rose clear. "Mama!" Head snapped around. A little girl, hair in loose braids, had broken free of her mother's grasp and run forward, clutching a rag doll. She flung her arms around Ada's skirts. "Mama, I like him," she said, looking up at Jonah with fearless eyes. The girl's mother hurried forward, cheeks blazing. "Hush, child, that ain't your butt." The words stuck, caught in the silence, for the crowd had already heard what mattered. Ada bent, stroked the girl's hair, then looked over the heads of her neighbors, the same neighbors who had laughed at her shame, whispered her ruin, wagered her life. Her voice rang plain. "You can call me what you want, but she calls me mother. And she squeezed Jonah's hand, calls me wife. That's more name than any of you will ever take from me." The crowd shifted, uneasy. Shame, when turned back, bites harder than pride. One by one, eyes fell. Boots scuffed dirt. And for the first time in a long while, Dry Creek grew silent, not from cruelty, but from being made to look at itself. Jonah felt the heat of Ada's grip, the brass pressing into his bone. He looked at her profile, strong and unshaken, and realized the bet had ended, but the vow had only just begun. The days that followed the crowd's silence carried a new weight. Dry Creek still whispered. Of course towns always do, but the tone had shifted. There was less venom, more unease, as if folks weren't sure anymore where shame lived. Some even nodded stiffly when Jonah rode through, though none dared greet Ada with kindness yet. Back at the cabin, the cottonwoods grew bright with new leaves, their sap sticky and sweet. The creek, swollen with meltwater, sang louder than the gossip of any town. And inside the cabin, life folded itself into small, steady rhythms. Ada sweeping the hearth, Jonah patching the roof, 2 sets of boots by the door. One evening, as the sun bled orange through the trees, Jonah found Ada in the yard, kneeling by a patch of earth she'd cleared with her bare hands. The soil was dark, damp from the thaw. "What's this?" he asked, leaning on the fence post. "Garden," she said simply, pressing a seed into the dirt. "Beans first, then maybe squash. Something that lasts." Jonah watched her fingers, blackened with soil, tender as they tucked the seed down. He thought of the bent brass ring on his hand, of the paper turned to ash, of the child in town calling her mama. Shame had burned away, but what grew in its place was quieter, harder to name. "You think it'll take root?" he asked. Ada looked up at him, her hair catching the gold light, her wrist scar pale against the dark earth. "It already has." That night, as the fire dimmed low, Jonah sat on the bench, whittling a piece of pine into a crude shape, a small box. Ada sewed by lamplight, her stitches neat, the torn hem now whole. When he finished, he set the box on the table between them. "For what?" she asked, tilting her head. Jonah opened his hand. The bent brass ring sat in his palm, the horsehair loop beside it. "For these," he said. "When the time's right, we'll bury them here. Let the earth keep what the town tried to own." Ada studied the rings a long moment, then reached across, laying her scarred wrist gently over his hand. "Not yet," she said softly. "Let them remind us a little longer. Scars don't vanish, they heal into proof." Jonah's throat tightened. He closed his fingers over hers, holding both rings and her hand in the same grip. The silence stretched, not heavy, not sharp, just full. And when he bent and pressed his lips to her wrist, not to the soft skin, but to the burn scar itself, Ada drew in a breath that sounded like the first thaw of spring. She didn't pull away. She let him kiss what the world had called ugly, until it became something else. Weeks later, a lantern glowed warm in the cabin window, visible from the creek. Inside, Ada's garden sprouted green shoots. A quilt lay folded on the bed. 2 mugs of coffee steamed on the table, bitter and black. Outside, Brandy stamped her hoof, patient as ever. There was no triumph in it, no grand victory. Only the quiet, stubborn fact of survival, bound by firelight, soil, and the weight of one hand that never let go. And if a traveler had passed that way, hearing the cottonwoods sigh in the wind, they might have asked themselves, what keeps a heart alive in a place like this? A kiss, a scar, or the memory of one hand that held fast when all the world turned away?